Hello, and welcome to my channel. The AI industry is in clear need of renewed oxygen, both from the supplier side, such as through a leap in multimodality, and the demand side, by means of new application breakthroughs to widen and deepen adoption. A steady rate of significant innovative cumulativeness cannot be ruled out, but it cannot be taken for granted either. For now, the industry is navigating a rather tangled economic and financial predicament. I address here the risks involved with a focus on the structural dynamics and underlying priors: projected demand growth, irreversible capital commitments, the growing use of private credit intermediation, and the narrow span of early adoption. After heeding the lessons from earlier technological transitions, I conclude that the industry's fragility stems, above all, from the stress generated by strong bets around a promising but still insufficiently tried technology. A final reflection focuses on what I qualify as a missing strategic perspective for the industry. The sharp differences surrounding hypotheses around the AI or an AI-related correction appear quite polarized, but are narrower than they may appear. The language of international financial institutions may be circumspect, but its content is increasingly convergent with concerns typically voiced in less sober registers. Kita Gopinath, after leaving the IMF, highlights the risks embedded in the unprecedented concentration of capital leverage and expectations surrounding a small cluster of AI-intensive firms. A sharp correction in these high-valuation sectors could hence propagate with disproportionate effects. Her argument rests on a specific assumption that the coupling between outlier AI valuations, non-bank credit exposures, and globally diversified investor portfolios is sufficiently tight that even moderate shocks could generate outsized spillovers. If financial authorities, the Bank of England, the Bank of International Settlements, the European Central Bank, the Federal Reserve System, and the IMF, share many of these underlying concerns, but they couch them within a broader reading of structural resilience, as they emphasize a different set of priors. Corporate balance sheets remain comparatively robust. Leverage, while rising, hasn't yet reached destabilizing thresholds. The banking system is substantially better capitalized than before the great financial crisis in 2008, and macroprudential tools offer meaningful buffers against funding market stress. From this vantage point, the AI bill tapped out resembles a concentrated sectoral expansion whose vulnerabilities warrant monitoring, but are still somewhat short of provoking an imminent systemic disruption. I focus next on how this unfolding picture is being affected by the specific structural conditions of the US AI industry, that is, the projected demand growth, the inertia of capital commitments, the rising role of private credit channels, and the still narrow span of adoption. Will the market validate the scale, timing, and composition of current AI investment decisions? Given that the industry's sustained pace of capital formation hinges on the still pending emergence of supply-side breakthroughs and demand-side catalysts that can prompt broad adoption, how likely is it that the flow of committed capital will be matched by the maturation of complementary organizational and financial adaptations at the rate required to turn strong bets into durable growth? The present rhythm of build-out reflects a peculiar asymmetry. For one thing, hyperscalers, semiconductor firms, and financial intermediaries are converging around an investment regime with increasingly low payback expectations, significant energy requirements, and rising operational leverage. For another, enterprise adoption remains concentrated in a limited number of subsectors, software, online services, certain data-intensive industries like finance, where clear use cases exist and switching costs are low. Outside these early adopters, the diffusion of AI tools has been markedly slower, challenged by integration difficulties, organizational hurdles, and the absence of clear productivity gains. The mismatch between broad investment and narrow adoption places unusual pressure on the underlying assumptions. Projected AI demand growth assumes rapid expansion, augmented workflows across the board. Capital commitment trajectories presume enduring access to cheap credit and stable refinancing conditions. Private credit intermediation presupposes that borrowers' revenue models will mature at a pace that keeps leverage enough to broaden demand without major delays. Each of these priors might be plausible on its own. The question is whether they can hold simultaneously. In fact, AI diffusion may proceed in fits and starts over long periods, during which infrastructure is built faster than economically justified. Given long lead times, irreversible capital commitments, and increasing leveraged financing structures, a demand shortfall will not necessarily reduce investment significantly, but expose the rigidity of existing commitments and question their continuity. Under plausible demand shortfalls, say in the range of 20–30%, the majority of the build-out towards 2030 remains effectively non-adjustable. The bulk of data centers, power infrastructure, long-term grid contracts, and GPU allocations are bound to continue forward, with the resulting combination of underutilized capacity and fixed financial obligations, compressed margins, and premature asset impairments. For hyperscalers, this would configure a profitability shock rather than a solvency threat, but it would reduce the scope for continued expansion and transmit financial stress outward. The locus of vulnerability lies in the highly leveraged infrastructure intermediaries, GPU lessors, power-hungry specialized operators, data center real estate investors, and structured financial vehicles who depend on high utilization, favorable refinancing conditions, and buoyant collateral values. Localized defaults, restructurings, and distressed asset sales become likely. Liabilities remain long-lived, while the economic life of the assets shortens. The shock is transmitted into the broader financial system through non-bank credit channels, private credit funds, pension funds, and insurance portfolios, where exposure to AI-related infrastructure is more concentrated. Losses materialize not in single events, but through sequence of credit downgrades, covenant breaches, and decreasing recovery values. This pattern matches neither classical bubble dynamics nor a traditional credit crunch. Rather, it is a risk-splitting unwind where losses surface progressively across actors whose exposure was previously framed as strategically desirable. All this would take place under conditions of policy space compression. High interest rates, fiscal constraints, and geopolitical imperatives reduce the ability to cushion sectoral losses. Simultaneously, the very narrative that justifies the scale of AI investment, strategic indispensability, generates political pressure to sustain underutilized capacity even as demand disappoints, turning what was framed as a mission-critical infrastructure into a public obligation, thereby recoding investment risk into a latent macro-fiscal burden. Jointly, these mechanisms produce a scenario of sequential strain, earning compression at the top, financial distress among leveraged intermediaries, valuation and recovery deterioration in non-bank credit channels, and mounting pressure on public balance sheets. With commitments that are long-lived, tightly interwoven, and barely reversible, a demand shortfall would be tantamount to a stress test that reveals how far AI's capital intensity, leverage, and strategic framing have turned a technology boom into a structure of capital commitment fragility. These structural tensions have clear precedents in earlier episodes of general-purpose technology formation. Most GPTs, general-purpose technologies, pass through stages of overbuild, uneven adoption, and long lags between capital formation and economic validation. Two cases, railways and electrifications, offer most instructive analogs. Others, such as steam and internal combustion engine, help to delimit the range of possible diffusion paths. Railways required massive and irreversible upfront investment. Fixed track networks, rolling stock stations, and signaling systems, for instance. Financing these projects rested on expectations of future traffic. Expectations that often ran ahead of actual demand. The British railway mania of the 1840s is the most cited example, but similar cycles occur as well in the US, France, and Germany. Early lines frequently overestimated freight volumes and underestimated complementary requirements such as standardization, urban planning, and coordinated logistics. Over time, as complementary adaptations mature matured. Regularized schedules, integrated freight corridors, time standardization, and improved management practices, the railway system became central to industrial growth. In the case of electrification, financial risks were affected by speculative cycles and more embedded in organizational inertia. Although electric power spread rapidly in urban centers, the resulting productivity gains appear only decades later. Factories rewired for electricity saw limited efficiency improvements until they reorganized production flows around decentralized motors, flexible layouts, and continuous processing. Electricity did not deliver immediate gains because firms initially used it as drop-in replacement for steam and water power. Only once managers redesigned plants, retrained workers, and altered supply good coordination did electrification generate the productivity advances now taken for granted. Steam, the earliest industrial GPT, diffused slowly and evenly. It remained costly, maintenance intensive, and context dependent for decades. Regions with cheap water power or limited access delayed adoption, and many early steam power enterprises struggled to recover their capital costs. Its diffusion demonstrates that even when a technology is transformative, adoption may proceed unevenly, amplifying fragility at the early stages. By contrast, the internal combustion engine exhibited a far faster uptake since it met a broad and latent consumer demand. The complementary infrastructure, petroleum refining, road building, service standards, co-evolved more rapidly, reducing validation lags. In some, these cases underscore three structural lessons. First, GPTs often require extraordinary levels of irreversible investment long before demand is validated. Second, the transformative impact depends on complementary organizational, institutional, and infrastructural adjustments. And third, the timing mismatch between commitment and validation is rooted in the deep structural uncertainty inherent in GPT transitions. The sustainability of the AI build-out rests on several interactive constraints across demand, finance, infrastructure, and energy. Their combined effect shapes the degree of fragility more than any individual factor. Adoption remains concentrated among software and digital native firms, while sectors with complex legacy systems like manufacturing, healthcare, logistics, the public sector move slowly due to integration costs and uncertain returns. Hyperscalers, however, are building capacity up to meet broad economy-wide uptake. They are doing it largely attuned to prior trends towards digital expansion, but also under the influence of hyped demand forecasts. For them, capital formation is rapid and front-loaded, while the organizational transformations needed to generate sustained demand unfold much more slowly. Private credit now finances a significant portion of GPU clusters, graphic processing units clusters, and data center expansions. Asset-backed models such as Core with rely on collaterals with short depreciation cycles and limited secondary markets, making them vulnerable to refinancing pressures rate shifts, and GPU supply fluctuations. Corporate balance sheets models such as Oracle's are more diversified but still hinge on utilization scaling beyond early adopters. The key weakness results from the gap between investment commitment schedules and the slower pace at which validation, adoption, monetization, productivity gains materializes. The system becomes fragile when workloads are complementary and complementary capabilities remain underdeveloped, thus undermining sustainability. After adjusting for distortions in CapEx data, the implied compound average growth rate for 2026 to 2030 converges towards, in my calculation, towards 13 to 18% range. This places the projected expansion of data center investment well above pre-AI historic baselines, which were between 7 and 10% per annum, but well below exuberant forecasts of AI demand, which range in the 25-30%. The resulting tension between historical and projected capacity growth and between projected capacity and the still highly concentrated and uneven diffusion of the technology highlights the depth of potential overexposure now embedded in the system. The current circular deals among most key players in the AI industry, in the US AI industry, function as devices for redistributing risk. By embedding long-duration commitments, vendor financing, and joint provisioning of assets, these arrangements transform concentrated commercial risk into shared system-level exposure. Model developers and platform firms shed part of their standalone demand risk by transferring it to hardware suppliers, infrastructure owners, and financiers whose assets are more illiquid and less easily redeployed. Taken in the aggregate, these arrangements do more than redistribute private risk. They financialize the current phase of the AI-driven transformation. The result is a structural postponement of sector-wide price discovery, temporarily cushioning underlying imbalances. All this brings us back to the only way out of the current predicament, that is, aside from cost structure improvements, of course, renewed breakthroughs that radically improve the technology and broaden adoption at a pace that effectively reduces the investment commitment demand validation gap. So let's come to a brief conclusion before the final remarks. Recent financing patterns reinforce why these conversions cannot be taken for granted. US firms are reported to have issued over $200 billion in AI-related corporate bonds in a single year, contributing to what JP Morgan projects will be a record $1.81 trillion in total investment-grade AI-driven corporate issuance. Goldman Sachs estimates that jumbo technology offerings already account for over 1/4 of all net corporate debt supply in the US economy. This is evidence of capital commitment front-loading at unprecedented speed. The implications follow directly from the structural dynamics I have just analyzed. In the last resort, fragility arises from a coupling of extraordinary commitments and moderate and loop-sided uptake. So let me go to my closing remarks. Beyond the sources of weakness facing the US AI industry, there lies a still deeper concern. That is, a growing confusion about where the true comparative advantage actually resides. At the firm level, model developers originally set themselves to draw their strength from their capacity to invent new architectures and develop new learning methods in the pursuit of the holy grail of superintelligence. Increasingly, however, they are drifting toward different pursuits: vertical integration, control over compute, ownership of data center infrastructure, and privileged access to energy and chips. This reordering of priorities does not merely intensify tensions within the industry, which are already pretty explicit, it also blurs its pattern of specialization. Industrial organization theory, from Richardson to Penrose, and Penrose to Teese and Williamson, suggests that firms which weaken specialization instead of consolidating their core capabilities tend to incur coordination losses, destroy learning rents, and lose strategic advantage. In their thirst for rent, model developers are moving backward into infrastructure, seeking control over data centers, power contracts, and supply chains, while hyperscalers are moving forward into models and applications. That is, instead of deepening specialization, this dual movement compresses the industry toward a crowded middle, where firms increasingly imitate each other's strategies rather than extending their own distinctive strengths. A parallel ambiguity is now visible at the country level. The US seems increasingly inclined to compete with China on the basis of scale, infrastructure density, and vertical integration, rather than articulating a distinct paradigm grounded in neurocognitive science-intensive and epistemic-driven innovation, institutional experimentation, architectural originality, and indeed cost advantage. The competitive drive is shifting towards outmoded models of industrial scale: more fabs, more data centers, more power, more centralization. The unresolved question for firms and countries alike is whether leadership in AI will ultimately stem from owning more of the existing stack or from redefining the stack itself. Until the prevailing paradigm is confronted head-on, much that appears as strategic consolidation may in fact be little more than organizational retrenchment. Thank you very much.